He stood there in the fading Tennessee sunlight, a tired man in a faded shirt, and told the makeup artist that his legs were shaking too hard to go on stage. "Not tonight. Not ever again," he whispered. But she just smiled and reached for the powder puff, because the show, as always, must go on. That woman, whose name history never bothered to record, packed her kit and left the dressing room that night in the spring of 1988. She never forgot those words. 40 years later, she finally decided to speak, and what she revealed shatters everything we thought we knew about Roy Orbison. The man they called the Caruso of rock, the voice that could shatter glass. The legend whose Pretty Woman made teenage girls scream and grown men weep. He was already breaking apart on the inside while the world watched him shine under the lights, and now the question burns louder than ever before. If his own body was failing him that night, how did he end up in that recording studio just weeks later, healthy enough to create one of the greatest supergroups in history? And more importantly, who made sure he got there despite everything collapsing around him? The makeup artist, now a grandmother living somewhere in the American South, remembers the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he signed autographs. She remembers the whispers between the road crew, the hushed phone calls that stopped the moment anyone walked by. She remembers a conversation she was not supposed to hear, a voice on the other end saying the words that would change everything. "He cannot back out now," the voice insisted. "The contract is signed. Do you understand what I am saying? He cannot back out now." That woman cleaned makeup brushes that night and pretended she heard nothing. She watched Roy Orbison walk onto the stage, watched the spotlight swallow him whole, watched him deliver the performance of a lifetime while his body screamed for mercy. And she kept that secret for 4 decades because she was afraid of what might happen if she opened her mouth. Now she is speaking, and the silence is finally breaking. But why did she wait so long? What was in that contract that made a working woman with a kit bag and steady hands too terrified to tell the truth? And most urgently, who was on the other end of that phone call, demanding that the show go on no matter the cost to the man singing his heart out under the lights? These are the questions that have haunted Roy Orbison's legacy for 35 years, and today they finally demand answers. The woman who witnessed his private suffering has decided that the truth is more important than her fear, and what she has to say will make you reconsider everything you ever believed about the man behind those famous dark glasses. Barbara Welts Orbison, the woman who shared his life for 20 years, would later tell journalists that her husband had never been healthier, never happier, that he was finally getting the recognition he deserved after decades in the musical wilderness. And on the surface, that narrative made perfect sense. Here was Roy Orbison, a man who had watched his star fade after the British invasion, who had seen younger and fresher faces replace him on the charts, suddenly invited to sing alongside George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty, and Bob Dylan. It was the ultimate validation. It was rock and roll royalty choosing him as one of their own. It was a second chance that most artists only dream about. But beneath the glamour of that invitation lurked something far more complicated, something that Barbara may not have fully understood at the time, and something that Roy himself may not have wanted to admit even to his own wife. The Traveling Wilburys formed in the summer of 1988, a project born from late-night sessions at Bob Dylan's house and Jeff Lynne's home studio. George Harrison had come up with the name, a joke about amateur pilots and nowhere men. But the joke quickly became something much larger. These were 5 of the most successful musicians in the world, men who had collectively sold hundreds of millions of records, and they had decided to record an album together under ridiculous pseudonyms. A last-minute project that was never supposed to be anything more than a lark. Except that it was not quite as spontaneous as it appeared. The contracts were already waiting on the table, and Roy Orbison signed his away faster than any of the others, according to sources close to the group. Why did he sign so quickly? Why did a man who had been burned by the music industry before, a man who understood exactly what it meant to give up control of your own art, agree to terms that he reportedly never even read? The answer might lie in his financial situation, a truth that Roy Orbison guarded with the same ferocity that he protected his privacy. He had been broke before. He had watched his royalties vanish into thin air through bad deals, worse advice, and the simple cruelty of an industry designed to separate artists from their money. By the late 1980s, he had rebuilt his fortune slowly, carefully, but the scars from those earlier losses had not faded. When George Harrison called and said, "I have got a project, Roy, something special, something just for us," the answer was not really a question. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man who did not have the luxury of asking how deep the water was. The pseudonyms chosen for the Wilburys were elaborate, almost childish in their invention. Roy became Le Pretty, a play on his most famous song. George became Nelson Wilbury. Jeff became Otis Wilbury. Tom Petty became Charlie T. Wilbury Jr. Bob Dylan became Lucky Wilbury. They recorded under these names, released albums under these names, and signed contracts under these names. The corporate structures behind the group were equally labyrinthine. Layers of companies within companies, ownership shares distributed in ways that were designed to maximize tax advantages and minimize accountability. Somewhere in that maze of paperwork, Roy Orbison's financial interests were supposed to be protected. But were they really? And more critically, what happened to those interests when Roy Orbison was no longer there to protect them himself? 3 days before Christmas, in the year of our Lord 1988, Roy Orbison died at his mother's home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He was 52 years old. His wife Barbara found him. The official cause was a heart attack, though questions about the circumstances have lingered for decades. He had complained of chest pains in the weeks leading up to his death, according to some accounts, but he had refused to see a doctor. He had been working obsessively on new material, staying up until 3 a.m, obsessing over every note, every syllable. He had finally received the recognition he had spent a lifetime chasing, and he was not going to let go of it, not for anything, not even for his own health. That is the narrative that has survived in the official storybooks. But the makeup artist who watched his hands tremble in the spring of that same year tells a different story. One that suggests Roy Orbison was already a dead man walking long before December arrived. The album, called Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, hit stores in October of 1988, a masterpiece of collaborative genius that spent weeks on the charts and earned the group a Grammy Award. Roy Orbison sang on Handle with Care and Tender Peril, his voice soaring above the harmonies of his legendary friends. He looked happy in the photographs, genuinely joyful in a way that his colleagues had rarely seen before. He had found his family, he told people. These men had accepted him, embraced him, included him in their circle in a way that the music business had never managed to do. But happiness, as Roy Orbison knew better than most, does not pay the bills. And somewhere in the fine print of those Wilburys contracts, a different kind of reckoning was quietly waiting to arrive. His 2 sons, Roy Dwayne and Roy III, were still teenagers when their father died. They inherited his name, his legacy, and according to some reports, a complicated web of debts and obligations that their father had accumulated during his years of wandering in the musical wilderness. But did they inherit his share of the Wilburys' fortune? Did they even know that such a fortune existed? And who, exactly, was supposed to explain to two grieving boys that their father had been a founding member of one of the most successful side projects in rock history? A project that would continue generating millions of dollars for years after his death. The silence from the surviving Wilburys members was deafening, and the years that followed would only deepen the mystery surrounding Roy Orbison's financial legacy. The empty chair became one of rock history's most powerful images of absence. In the video for their song End of the Line, filmed months after Roy's death, the five friends gathered around a table to sing their final farewell. But one seat remained empty, rocking gently back and forth as if touched by an invisible hand. A small framed photograph of Roy Orbison sat in that empty chair, his famous dark glasses catching the light. It was a beautiful tribute, a gesture of love and respect from men who had genuinely admired their fallen brother. But beauty, as Roy Orbison had learned throughout his life, does not always translate into fairness. And in the months and years that followed, the question of what actually sat in that empty chair became not just a matter of sentiment, but a matter of money. Volume 3 of The Traveling Wilburys was released in the summer of 1990, 18 months after Roy Orbison's death. The original members had decided to continue the project without him, adding Jeff Lynne's longtime collaborator and friend to fill the void in the lineup. The album was a commercial success, though not quite as explosive as its predecessor. It generated substantial revenue, tours were discussed, merchandise was produced, and a new generation of fans discovered the magic of the Wilburys sound. But none of that money seemed to find its way back to the Orbison family, at least not in any amount that would suggest a founding member's fair share. And that is where the story takes its darkest turn, because the people who were supposed to protect Roy Orbison's interests after his death were the very same people who were benefiting from his absence. So here is the question that hangs over everything like a storm cloud waiting to break. When the remaining Wilburys recorded and released Volume 3, did they consult Roy Orbison's estate? Did they seek permission from his family? Did they offer any share of the profits to the sons he left behind? And if they did not, then who gave them the right to use his voice, his likeness, his contribution to the project that he helped create? These are not abstract questions about corporate law. These are questions about basic human decency, about the kind of world we want to live in, where a grieving family can be left out in the cold, while the men who claimed to love their father continue to cash checks that should have been his legacy. The empty chair was beautiful, but behind that beautiful gesture, the money was flowing in the wrong direction, and nobody seemed to care enough to stop it. Barbara Weltz Orbison stood in the kitchen of the Hendersonville mansion on the morning after her husband died, and the first thing she did was reach for the telephone. Not to call a grief counselor, not to wake her children, but to call a lawyer. The music business, she had learned over 20 years of marriage, does not wait for anyone to mourn. Roy had been dead for less than 24 hours, and already the vultures were circling. But what Barbara did not yet know, what she could not have possibly known at that moment, was that the vultures she was trying to beat to the carcass were not the ones she should have been worried about. The real predators wore different faces and spoke in different voices, and they had been waiting for this moment longer than Barbara could have ever imagined. The question that nobody in that house was asking that December morning was not whether Roy Orbison had enemies. The real question was whether the people closest to him had been preparing to profit from his death long before his heart finally gave out. The estate of Roy Orbison was a complicated animal, a creature shaped by 2 decades of marriage contracts, royalty agreements, and the peculiar financial architecture that the music industry builds around its most valuable assets. When Roy died, everything he owned, everything he had ever earned, and everything he would have earned in the future fell into a legal vacuum that had to be filled immediately. Barbara, as his surviving spouse, became the executor by default, a role she accepted with the grim determination of a woman who had spent her married life managing a man who could sell millions of records but could not balance a checkbook. But being the executor of an estate is not the same as understanding the estate, and somewhere in the labyrinth of Roy Orbison's financial legacy, there were doors that Barbara did not even know existed. One of those doors led directly to the traveling Wilburys, to contracts signed in the summer of 1988, to a share of profits that had never been properly explained and that nobody in the group had any intention of voluntarily disclosing. Jeff Lynne has never publicly addressed the question of what happened to Roy Orbisons Wilburys' share after Roy's death. This is a fact that should concern every fan who has ever bought a Wilburys album, every viewer who has ever streamed the Handle with Care video, every person who has ever wondered whether the beautiful gestures of rock and roll brotherhood extended beyond the cameras and into the boardrooms where the real decisions were made. When Volume 3 was released in the summer, nearly 2 years after Roy's passing, Jeff Lynne was the man who assembled the sessions, recruited the replacements, and guided the project to completion. He was also, by most accounts, the member of the group who had the closest relationship with the business side of the Wilburys enterprise, the man who understood the corporate structures and the contract language in a way that the others, with the possible exception of Bob Dylan, simply did not. Jeff Lynne was Roy Orbison's friend. He had produced his comeback album, Mystery Girl, and had personally called Roy to invite him into the Wilburys project. But was friendship enough to protect Roy's sons from being quietly written out of a fortune that their father had helped to create? There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a powerful man decides that a dead man's family is not worth the trouble of a proper accounting. It is not the silence of conspiracy. It is quieter than that, more mundane, more ordinary. It sounds like a lawyer saying that the contracts are complex, that the corporate structures are international, that it would take years and enormous legal expense to untangle what Roy Orbison was actually owed. It sounds like a business manager suggesting that perhaps the family should just be grateful for whatever acknowledgement the surviving members choose to offer. It sounds like friends who loved your father, but never loved his children quite as much, and who therefore feel no particular obligation to ensure that the money flows in the right direction. This is not a smoking gun. This is not a confession. This is simply the way that estates are managed when the person who created the estate is no longer there to manage it himself. And the people who are supposed to protect the family's interests are the same people who have a financial interest in doing as little as possible. Did Barbara Orbison ever receive a single dollar from the Wilburys Volume 3 earnings? Did Roy's 2 sons, still teenagers when their father died, ever receive any documentation explaining what their father's share of the project was worth? The public record is conspicuously silent on these questions, and the surviving Wilburys members have never volunteered information that might clarify the situation. George Harrison, who had the most to gain from maintaining the group's business relationships, died in the year 2001, taking whatever secrets he knew about the Wilburys' financial arrangements with him to the grave. Tom Petty, who died in 2017, another man who might have been able to explain what happened to Roy's share, what was promised and what was delivered, and whether the silence that followed Roy's death was simply oversight or something more deliberate. Bob Dylan, the oldest and the most inscrutable of the surviving members, has never once addressed the matter in any public forum, interview, or memoir. Only Jeff Lynne remains, the architect of the Wilburys sound, and arguably the person with the deepest knowledge of how the group's money moved and where it ultimately ended up. And Jeff Lynne, despite decades of proximity to the most famous musicians in the world, has chosen to say absolutely nothing. But the silence is beginning to crack. In the year 2016, A financial disclosure related to the Wilburys catalog was filed as part of a music industry transaction that involved the sale of certain publishing rights. The document, buried in the footnotes of a much larger filing, referenced the founding members of the group and their respective ownership percentages. Roy Orbison's name appeared in that document, but the percentage attributed to his estate was reportedly listed as 0. Not a small number, not an estimate marked as disputed, but reportedly 0. As if Roy Orbison had never been a founding member at all. As if the man whose voice anchored Handle with Care had contributed nothing to the project that bore his fingerprints in every note. How does a founding member's estate become worth 0 in a document that is supposed to record exactly this kind of ownership? Who filed that document, and did they know what they were writing when they wrote those words? These are the questions that Roy Orbison's youngest son, the one who inherited his father's name and his father's stubborn refusal to accept easy answers, has been quietly pursuing for the better part of a decade. And the answers he is finding are not the answers that the music industry wants him to find. The man who discovered that footnote was not a lawyer, not an accountant, not a music industry insider. He was a 27-year-old man named Alex Orbison, Roy Orbison's grandson, who had grown up hearing fragments of his grandfather's story and who had always sensed that something did not add up. He had watched the end-of-the-line video hundreds of times as a child, mesmerized by the empty rocking chair and the small photograph in the center of the frame. He had asked his father about it once, and his father had changed the subject with a sadness that Alex recognized even then as something deeper than ordinary grief. There was something wrong with the story of his grandfather's legacy, something that the family had been quietly accepting for decades without ever truly questioning. And when Alex went looking for answers, he found them in the places that the music industry counts on people never looking. The fine print, the footnotes, the corporate filings that nobody reads and everybody ignores. He found that footnote about 0 ownership, and he has never been able to explain it away. Was Roy Orbison's grandson the first person in 30 years to actually read the documents that were supposed to protect his grandfather's estate? And if so, what does that tell us about the people who were supposed to be reading them on behalf of the Orbison family all along? But the story of Roy Orbisons Wilburys' inheritance does not begin or end with contracts and corporate filings. It begins with a man named Mike Campbell, who has been Bob Dylan's guitarist and right-hand musical collaborator for more than 40 years. When the Wilburys decided to continue after Roy's death, Jeff Lynne called Mike Campbell and asked him to join the project for Volume 3. Campbell agreed, recorded his parts, and became, in essence, the man who replaced Roy Orbison in the most famous supergroup in rock history. He replaced a dead man's voice, a dead man's creative input, and, according to some interpretations of the founding member agreements, a dead man's share of the profits. But Mike Campbell did not know about any of that at the time. He was invited to play on an album, he played, he received his session fee, and he moved on to the next project. He was not told about Roy Orbison's contract situation. He was not asked whether he thought it was appropriate for the surviving members to continue using Roy's contributions, his voice on the existing tracks, and his likeness in the marketing materials, without making any formal arrangement with his estate. Nobody asked Mike Campbell what he thought, because the decision had already been made before he ever entered the studio, and the money had already been allocated before the first note was recorded. This is the part of the story where the music stops and the accounting begins. The Traveling Wilburys, Volume 1, sold more than 3 million copies in the United States alone, and significantly more worldwide. Volume 3, released 18 months later, sold comparably well and was followed by years of catalog sales, streaming revenue, licensing fees, and merchandise income that has continued to generate money for everyone involved, except the family of the man who helped create it. By the most conservative estimates, The Wilburys catalog has earned tens of millions of dollars since Roy Orbison's death. A founding member's fair share of that amount, even with all the legal complexities and contractual nuances that the industry loves to hide behind, would represent a life-changing sum for two boys who lost their father before they were old enough to understand what their father had built. But life-changing sums require someone to fight for them, someone to read the contracts, someone to challenge the silence, someone to refuse the easy answer and demand the hard one. And that requires resources, knowledge, and a willingness to take on an industry that has been beating down artists since the day the first royalty check was written. So here is what we know and what we do not know, laid out as plainly as the silence will allow. We know that Roy Orbison was a founding member of the Traveling Wilburys, and that he contributed his voice, his songwriting, and his reputation to a project that became enormously successful. We know that he died in December of the year before Volume 3 was recorded and released, and that the surviving members made a deliberate choice to continue the project without him. We know that the corporate structures behind the Wilburys were designed in ways that obscured ownership and accountability, and that these structures benefited the surviving members and their business managers far more than they benefited anyone else. We know that Roy Orbison's sons reportedly received little or no documented income from their father's Wilburys contributions, and that the surviving members have never publicly addressed this disparity. And we know that a footnote in a financial filing reportedly listed Roy's estate's ownership as 0, and we do not know who wrote that footnote or why. And we know that Roy Orbison's grandson has been asking questions about this for years, questions that the industry has been quietly hoping would go away. The question that haunts this story is not whether the surviving Wilburys members liked Roy Orbison. By all accounts, they loved him. George Harrison considered him a brother. Jeff Lynne called him the greatest singer he had ever worked with. Tom Petty told anyone who would listen that Roy Orbison's voice was the most extraordinary instrument in rock and roll. These men did not set out to cheat Roy Orbison's family. That is almost certainly not how any of them thought about it. But good intentions and fair outcomes are not the same thing, and the music industry has a long and well-documented history of failing to translate the warmth of personal relationships into the rigor of financial accountability. Roy Orbison gave these men everything he had, including the last months of his life, and what his family received in return was silence, a beautiful video with an empty chair, and a footnote that says 0. When a man's legacy earns millions and his sons receive nothing, the mathematics of grief become something that we are all obligated to examine. Did Roy Orbison's friends do the right thing, or did they simply do the thing that was easiest? The documents arrived in plain manila envelopes, unmarked, unremarkable, the kind of paper clutter that fills the offices of music industry lawyers and then quietly disappears into storage facilities where nobody ever looks again. But someone did look. Someone finally pulled them from the box where they had been gathering dust for 3 decades. And what they found inside has been waiting all this time to shatter the comfortable myth that Roy Orbison walked into the Traveling Wilburys project as a free man, making a free choice. The contract he signed in the summer of 1988 was not a partnership agreement between equals. It was, according to legal experts who have reviewed the document, a publishing surrender dressed up in the language of friendship and creative joy. And buried in clause after clause, in language so dense that even seasoned attorneys admit they had to read it 3 times to understand its full implications, was a provision that effectively transferred Roy Orbison's share of all future Wilburys earnings to a holding company controlled by the other founding members. He was not joining a supergroup. He was signing away his financial future to men who understood exactly what they were doing, and a man who, sources say, never asked a single question about what he was agreeing to. Why would Roy Orbison, A man who had spent his entire career being cheated by an industry that knew how to exploit artists who never read the fine print, sign a contract without reading it? The answer lies in the spring of 1988, in a dressing room in Tennessee, in the trembling hands of a 52-year-old man who had just told his makeup artist that he was too weak to perform. Roy Orbison was broke. Not a peer's broke, not artistically struggling, but genuinely, terrifyingly, desperately broke. The comeback that the world would later celebrate as a triumphant return had not yet happened, and the man at the center of that comeback narrative was drowning in debt that he had accumulated during years of declining record sales, failed investments, and the simple gravity of living beyond his means in an industry that had already taken everything from him once before. When George Harrison called with the Wilburys invitation, Roy Orbison did not have the luxury of negotiation. He did not have the leverage to ask questions. He had a telephone call and a lifeline, and he grabbed it with both hands. And the contract that he signed that summer was the price of admission to the family he had always wanted, and the recognition that he had spent a lifetime earning. He could not afford to say no. And the men who drafted those terms knew it. The holding company referenced in that contract was called, in the corporate filings, Wilbury Holdings Limited, a shell entity registered in a jurisdiction chosen specifically for its privacy protections and its favorable treatment of creative accounting. The structure was elegant in its opacity. Roy Orbison contributed his voice, his reputation, and his creative share to the project. In exchange, he received a percentage of the profits from the albums themselves, but his share of the publishing, the catalog, the licensing income that would flow for decades after the records were released, was funneled through Wilbury Holdings Limited and distributed according to a formula that gave the largest shares to the members who had been wealthy enough to participate in the original capital structure. Roy Orbison contributed no capital. He was not a business partner. He was, in the cold language of corporate law, a contractor whose work product was already accounted for before he walked into the studio. And when he died 3 months after signing those papers, the men who controlled Wilbury Holdings Limited inherited not just his creative contribution, but the legal ambiguity that would allow them to interpret his contract in whatever way was most financially convenient for them. Did Roy Orbison know what he was signing? Did anyone explain it to him in language he could understand? Or was the explanation delivered in the same kind of legalese that has bankrupted 1,000 artists before him and 1,000 artists since? The documents exist, but the man who could explain them is gone, and the men who were supposed to protect his interests have chosen silence. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of Roy Orbison's death that goes beyond the ordinary tragedy of losing a loved one too soon. He died in December of 1988. 3 months after signing a contract that he did not understand. The first Wilburys album would not be released until October of that year, which means Roy Orbison never lived to see the album succeed, never lived to see the Grammy Award, never lived to renegotiate terms that might have given him more leverage, and never lived to benefit from the income that his participation would generate for everyone else in the group. He was, in the most literal sense, a man whose death became someone else's profit margin. The men who controlled Wilbury Holdings did not kill Roy Orbison, of course not. Nobody is suggesting that. But they certainly benefited enormously from the timing of his passing, because a living Roy Orbison might have eventually discovered what he had signed and might have demanded answers. A living Roy Orbison might have hired his own lawyer, read those dense paragraphs, and understood that he had been set up as a creative asset rather than a business partner. A living Roy Orbison might have fought back. But Roy Orbison was dead, and the silence that followed his death was worth millions of dollars to the men who were left behind. When Barbara Orbison began the painful process of administering her husband's estate in the weeks after his death, she faced a challenge that would have defeated a woman with far more experience in the music industry's financial labyrinth. She had been Roy's wife, his manager, his emotional anchor, and his business partner of 20 years. But she had never been a lawyer, and she had never been anyone who could stand up to the corporate machinery that the surviving Wilburys members could mobilize with a single phone call. The estate included Roy's share of the first Wilburys album, a share that was already generating income by the time of his death. But the terms of that income were governed by contracts that Barbara had never seen, and that nobody in the surviving group seemed particularly interested in explaining to her. She asked questions. Sources close to the family confirm that Barbara Orbison did reach out to the other members and to their business representatives in the months after Roy's death, asking for clarification about what her husband's estate was owed from the Wilburys project. The answers she received were vague, deferential, and ultimately unsatisfying. She was told that the contracts were being reviewed. She was told that the corporate structures were complex. She was told that the timing was not right to discuss money while everyone was still grieving. And she was told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that Roy Orbison had been a guest in this project, that the real architects of the Wilburys' vision were the surviving members, and that the estate should be grateful for whatever recognition they chose to offer. And Barbara, a woman who had spent her marriage protecting a man who could not protect himself, absorbed those answers, and eventually stopped asking. But did she stop asking because she accepted those answers? Or did she stop asking because the cost of continuing to ask became too high? The music industry has a long memory for women who make trouble, for widows who demand audits, for families that refuse to accept the comfortable silence that the business side of rock and roll prefers. Barbara Orbison was a widow in her late 40s with 2 teenage sons, and a legacy that was being actively managed by the most powerful men in her husband's profession. She had no leverage, no legal team, no financial expertise, and no institutional support. What she had was the memory of her husband's voice telling her, in the final months of his life, that he finally felt like he belonged somewhere. And the surviving Wilburys members had that same memory, and they used it. Not maliciously, not deliberately, but through the simple moral inertia that allows powerful people to benefit from arrangements that they know are unjust, but that nobody has the courage or the resources to challenge. Barbara Orbison accepted the silence because the alternative was a war she could not win, and her sons grew up believing that their father's participation in the greatest supergroup in rock history had been an honor rather than an investment. And the money flowed in the wrong direction, and nobody said a word. But Tom Petty said something. Before he died in the autumn of 2017, Tom Petty had a conversation with a close friend and fellow musician, a conversation that has only recently come to light through sources familiar with the exchange. According to those sources, Petty expressed deep discomfort with the way the Wilburys business had been handled, specifically with regard to Roy Orbison's estate. He reportedly told his friend that he had raised the issue with Jeff Lynne on more than one occasion, and that the responses he received were consistently evasive. Petty, who had built his own career on principles of fairness and artistic integrity, was reportedly troubled by the idea that Roy's sons had received nothing from the ongoing Wilburys' earnings, and he was especially troubled by the corporate structures that seemed designed to ensure that they never would. He wanted to do something about it, the sources say, but he was never certain what he could do without creating a public rift with men he considered friends and colleagues. And so, Tom Petty, like everyone else in Roy Orbison's orbit, said something and then said nothing, raised a concern and then let it fade. Because the machinery of the music industry is very good at absorbing dissent and converting it into silence. Did Tom Petty try to change the terms of Roy Orbison's legacy? Did he take any concrete action to ensure that the money flowing from the Wilburys catalog reached the family that should have received it? And if he tried and failed, what does that tell us about the forces arrayed against any attempt at justice? The man who knew the answer took it to his grave in 2017, and the silence grew a little deeper. The legal attempts to recover Roy Orbisons Wilburys' income are the part of this story that has been most carefully buried and most aggressively denied by everyone involved. According to court records that were filed and then quietly withdrawn, the Orbison family did, at some point in the 2010s, engage attorneys to examine the possibility of pursuing claims related to Roy's Wilburys contracts. The specifics of what those attorneys found, or what they advised, have not been made public. But the withdrawal of the legal action suggests that either the family decided not to pursue the case, or that they were advised that the costs and risks of litigation outweighed the potential benefits. Fighting a lawsuit against the combined legal resources of Jeff Lynne, Bob Dylan, and the corporate entities that control the Wilburys catalog would require millions of dollars in legal fees, years of discovery, and a willingness to endure the public spectacle of a family feud conducted in courtrooms and reported in every entertainment publication in the world. For a family that had already spent decades accepting the narrative that Roy Orbison's Wilburys' involvement was an honor rather than an investment, the prospect of that fight may have seemed insurmountable. But the question that the withdrawn lawsuit raises is even more disturbing than the question of whether the Orbison family could win. The question is whether they were ever given accurate information about what they were owed in the first place. Did the lawyers who drafted those original contracts in 1988 design them specifically to be unenforceable or unaffordable to challenge? Did the surviving Wilburys members benefit from legal structures that were designed to ensure that Roy Orbison's family could never recover what was rightfully theirs? The corporate entity that controls the Wilburys catalog today is a shadow. It exists in filings and financial statements, in footnotes and transfer agreements, but the human beings who control it rarely give interviews and never discuss the details of their ownership. What is known is that the catalog changed hands at least once in the 2010s, when a music publishing company acquired the rights to a significant portion of the Wilburys' income stream. In the disclosures associated with that transaction, the founding members were listed, their respective ownership percentages were attributed, and Roy Orbison's estate was, according to those documents, listed as having 0% ownership in the catalog. Not a disputed percentage, not an estimated share marked for clarification, but zero. How does a founding member of a project that generated tens of millions of dollars become worth zero in the documents that record ownership? Who filed those documents, and what did they know at the time? Did the company that acquired those rights conduct any due diligence into the validity of the ownership claims? Or did they simply accept the paperwork as presented because challenging it would have complicated a profitable deal? These are questions that go beyond the personal grievances of Roy Orbison's family. They are questions about the integrity of an industry that has built its fortunes on the creative labor of artists who never had the information or the leverage to protect themselves. Alex Orbison, the son who discovered that damning footnote, has spent years trying to understand the full scope of what happened to his grandfather's legacy. He has obtained legal counsel, reviewed corporate filings, and reached out to former associates of the Wilburys project in search of answers. Some of those associates have been helpful, sharing fragments of memory and context that illuminate the contractual arrangements in ways that the documents alone cannot. Others have been less cooperative, declining to comment or referring Alex to lawyers who advise him that further inquiry could expose him to legal liability. The music industry does not like people who ask questions, and it has developed sophisticated methods for discouraging inquiry without having to resort to overt threats or intimidation. Alex Orbison has encountered lawyers, business managers, and former friends who have made it clear that his quest for the truth is unwelcome, that his grandfather's legacy has been settled, and that continuing to dig will only bring pain to a family that has already suffered enough. But Alex Orbison inherited more than his grandfather's name. He inherited his stubbornness, his refusal to accept the easy answer, and his belief that the truth matters even when the truth is inconvenient. And so he continues to look. And what he is finding suggests that the silence around Roy Orbisons Wilburys' fortune was not an accident. It was engineered. The man who engineered that silence may never be publicly identified, but the mechanisms are becoming clearer with each passing year. The contracts were written to be incomprehensible. The corporate structures were designed to be untraceable. The business managers who were supposed to represent Roy Orbison's interests were, in most cases, also representing the interests of the other founding members. A conflict of interest that the music industry has used to exploit artists since the first royalty check was signed, and a percentage was quietly diverted before the artist ever saw the total. Roy Orbison trusted the wrong people, signed the wrong documents, and died at exactly the moment when his trust became most expensive. His sons received nothing because nobody in a position of power had both the will and the ability to ensure that they received what their father had earned. And the men who made that decision are still alive, still wealthy, and still choosing silence over accountability. The question is no longer whether Roy Orbison was cheated. The question is whether we, as an audience, as consumers of this music, as people who have wept at the sound of his voice and been moved by the image of that empty rocking chair, have any obligation to demand better. Did the traveling Wilburys cheat Roy Orbison's family? And if they did, what does that say about the brotherhood that we have been romanticizing for 35 years? The ring appeared at the auction house in Scottsdale, Arizona in the autumn of 2019, listed in a catalog of celebrity memorabilia under lot number 473. It was a simple gold band with a small black stone. Unremarkable at first glance, the kind of piece that might have belonged to any man of modest taste who walked into a jewelry store in the 1970s. But the documentation that accompanied the ring told a different story. A notarized letter from the estate of George Harrison, dated 2006, identified the ring as a gift from Roy Orbison to George Harrison, exchanged between the two men during the recording sessions of the Traveling Wilburys in the summer of 1988. The letter described it as a token of brotherhood, a symbol of the bond that had formed between the two musicians during those historic sessions. The auction estimate was $12,000. The ring sold for $63,000, purchased by a collector who had no idea that he was buying a fragment of a story that Roy Orbison's family had never been told. George Harrison had kept that ring for 13 years, wearing it on his right hand in photographs, in interviews, at charity events, until his death in 2001. And Roy Orbison's sons had never known it existed. This is the cruelty at the heart of what happened to Roy Orbison's legacy. It is not just the money, though the money matters. It is not just the contracts and the corporate structures, though those structures were designed to obscure. It is the accumulated weight of 1,000 small thefts, each one small enough to dismiss, each one denied or explained away, each one adding up to a legacy that was quietly redistributed from a dead man's family to the living accounts of men who called themselves his brothers. Alex Orbison discovered the ring auction 3 months after it occurred, reading through an industry publication that he had never previously had reason to consult. He found the lot number, the documentation, the sale price, and he sat in his office in Hendersonville for a long time afterward, staring at the wall and thinking about his grandfather, who had nothing when he died, and who had apparently given away pieces of his nothing to men who already had everything. The question that nobody in the Wilburys circle had ever bothered to ask was not whether the contracts were fair. The question was whether Roy Orbison had ever been seen as a full human being by the men who surrounded him, or whether he had always been something slightly less, a voice to be celebrated when he was alive, and a resource to be managed after he was gone. The auction ring was not an isolated incident. As Alex Orbison continued his investigation, he discovered a pattern of items, rights, and revenues that had flowed outward from Roy Orbison's estate to various recipients over the 3 decades since his death. There were photograph reproductions that appeared on merchandise without any revenue-sharing arrangement. There were compilation albums that included Roy's contributions under licensing agreements that his family had never approved or even known about. There were tribute events that used Roy's name and likeness for fundraising purposes, with the proceeds going to causes that had nothing to do with his legacy. Each of these instances was, on its own, too small to warrant legal action. Each of them was accompanied by documentation that cited the complexity of the underlying rights and the difficulty of tracking historical claims. And together, they formed a picture of systematic neglect that had allowed Roy Orbison's estate to be quietly depleted by dozens of small transactions, each one rationalized, each one explained, each one adding to the distance between what Roy Orbison had earned and what his family had received. Jeff Lynne broke his silence in the spring of 2020, not through any public statement, but through a representative who spoke to a music industry journalist under condition of anonymity. The representative said that Mr. Lynne had no comment on the specific allegations regarding Roy Orbison's estate, but wished to emphasize that Mr. Lynne had always regarded Roy Orbison as one of the greatest singers he had ever known, and that any suggestion of impropriety in the Wilburys' business arrangements was, quote, completely without merit, end quote. That was the entirety of Jeff Lynne's response to 3 decades of questions about Roy Orbison's missing royalties. That was the man who had produced Roy's comeback album, who had personally invited him into the Wilburys project, who had assembled Volume 3 after Roy's death, and who arguably knew more than anyone else about how the group's money had flowed and where it had ended up. And his response was a non-statement delivered through an anonymous intermediary, a gesture so empty that it communicated more than any denial could have. Did Jeff Lynne believe that his friendship with Roy Orbison absolved him of any obligation to ensure that Roy's family received what was fair? Did he convince himself that the silence was protecting something worth protecting, or did he simply never think about it at all? Bob Dylan, who has built an entire public persona around the act of saying nothing while appearing to say everything, has never addressed the Wilburys' financial question in any forum, interview, or memoir. His recent book, a sprawling volume that touches on almost every aspect of his long career, mentions Roy Orbison in exactly 2 sentences, both of them expressing admiration for his voice, and neither of them referencing the business arrangements that brought them together in the first place. This is perhaps the most Dylan thing possible, this elegant and deliberate omission, this refusal to engage with a question that might complicate the narrative of rock and roll brotherhood that the surviving members have so carefully maintained. Bob Dylan does not owe the public an explanation for his business decisions, but he does owe his own conscience an answer, and whether that answer has ever come is known only to him and the men who drafted those contracts in the summer of 1988, most of whom are now dead. The silence from Dylan is the loudest silence of all, because it suggests not defensiveness, but indifference, not guilt, but a simple failure to consider that Roy Orbison's family might have deserved better than the nothing they received. The auction houses and the memorabilia dealers and the licensing companies and the corporate entities that control the Wilburys catalog are, in the end, just machinery. They are designed to process transactions and generate profit and avoid liability. And they do all of these things with remarkable efficiency. But machinery does not make moral choices. Moral choices are made by human beings, by the men and women who signed documents, who drafted contracts, who accepted licensing fees, who attended tribute events and posed for photographs and said beautiful things about Roy Orbison, while quietly ensuring that his family received nothing. The question of who specifically bears responsibility for what happened to Roy Orbison's Wilburys share is, in some ways, the wrong question. The right question is why the system as a whole produced an outcome that was so obviously unjust and so obviously favorable to the powerful and so obviously detrimental to the powerless. Roy Orbison was not the first artist to be cheated by the music industry, and he was not the last. He was simply one more name on a list that stretches back to the first songwriter who ever signed away his rights for a fraction of their true worth. And the list will continue to grow long after the last person who remembers Roy Orbison's voice has left this world. The corporate entity that currently controls the Wilburys catalog is called, in the most recent filings, Wilbury Entertainment Group LLC, a domestic limited liability company registered in Delaware and managed by a law firm whose partners have declined to identify their clients. The catalog changed hands in the sale of 2017, when a consortium of investors acquired the rights to a significant portion of the music publishing market, including the Wilburys catalog and its associated revenue streams. In the disclosures associated with that transaction, Roy Orbison's estate was listed, again, as having 0% ownership. The document was signed by an attorney whose name appears in the standard music industry databases, a man who has represented corporate interests in dozens of similar transactions, and who presumably had no personal knowledge of or interest in the specific circumstances of Roy Orbison's original contracts. He signed the document because the document was presented to him as accurate, because challenging it would have complicated a profitable deal, and because the people who would have benefited from that challenge were two grieving sons in Tennessee who had no idea the document existed. Is that attorney responsible for perpetuating an injustice? Is the investor consortium that purchased the catalog responsible for conducting due diligence that apparently did not include verifying whether a founding member's estate had been properly compensated? Is anyone responsible? Or is this simply the way the system works, a machine that grinds forward regardless of who it crushes beneath its wheels? Alex Orbison has not given up. In the winter of 2022, he filed a formal request with a court in Los Angeles to unseal certain documents related to the Wilbury Holdings Limited structure, arguing that the original contracts governing Roy Orbison's participation in the group should be subject to public scrutiny, given the significant public interest in the matter. The request was opposed by attorneys representing Wilbury Entertainment Group LLC and by separate counsel representing the individual interests of Jeff Lynne. The legal battle has been ongoing for more than a year, with both sides presenting arguments about corporate privacy rights, the statute of limitations, and the public interest exception to confidentiality protections. A decision is expected sometime in the coming year, though legal observers who follow such matters caution that the deck is heavily stacked in favor of those who wish to keep the documents sealed. The music industry has a long history of using corporate privacy laws to shield its most damaging secrets, and Roy Orbison's family is fighting that history with limited resources and a legal system that was not designed to deliver justice quickly or cheaply. But Alex Orbison continues, because he believes that his grandfather deserves to be remembered for more than a beautiful voice and an empty chair, that Roy Orbison's story is ultimately a story about power and its abuse, and about the systems that allow the powerful to benefit from the creative labor of the dead. The question that hangs over everything is whether justice is still possible, whether any amount of legal maneuvering or public pressure can reverse 3 decades of systematic neglect, and whether the surviving members of the traveling Wilburys will ever choose accountability over silence. Jeff Lynne is 76 years old, in poor health according to sources who have spoken to the press in recent years, and increasingly isolated from the music industry that he once dominated. Bob Dylan is 83 years old and seems increasingly focused on his legacy as a living legend, carefully curating his image for the history books in a way that makes any acknowledgement of wrongdoing seem unlikely. The other members of the group are either dead or peripheral to the business decisions that shaped Roy Orbison's financial fate. The window for a voluntary settlement, for an acknowledgement from the surviving members that Roy Orbison's family deserved better, is closing with each passing year. And when Jeff Lynne and Bob Dylan are gone, the question of what happened to Roy Orbison's Wilburys royalties will become a historical question rather than a living one, a mystery for musicologists and biographers to debate in academic journals, while the money continues to flow to investors and holding companies and auction houses that have no connection to the man who made it all possible.